Hello. Welcome, and thank you for coming this evening. My name is Barb May. I'm Associate Dean here at St. Ben's and St. John's, and I want to take a brief minute to provide the reason for this presentation tonight. This lecture is the second annual Norman L. Ford Science Literacy Lecture, and also co-sponsored by the Nicholas and Bernice Reuter Professorship in Science and Religion. I want to take a brief minute to discuss the meaning of these two series that has brought Professor Arkin here today. The Ford Lecture Series addresses contemporary and cutting-edge scientific topics while encouraging students and the public to become more conversant with the relevance of science in our everyday lives. The series is made possible through a generous support of a St. John's alumnus who wanted to, an anonymous alumnus, who wanted to honor one of his favorite and most inspiring professors, Norman Ford, who is a professor emeritus of biology. And then the Reuter Professorship was established in 2005 to support the work of a CSB SJU professor in the intersection of science and religion. And this is funded through a generous support of St. John's alumnus, Dr. Nicholas Reuter, who's in the audience tonight, of the Coburn Cancer Center, and then his wife, a CSB alumna, Bernice Reuter, who are also here. I want to thank both our anonymous donor who could not be here for the Norman Ford Lecture and the Reuters for their generous gift in allowing us to bring in speakers like Professor Arkin, and I will have Dr. Noreen Hertzfeld now, who is the Reuter Professor of Science and Religion, introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ron Arkin. Ron is Regents Professor and Associate Dean for Research and Space Planning at the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech. He received a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Michigan, a master's also in chemistry from Stevens Institute of Technology, and a PhD in computer science from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Dr. Arkin's research interests include behavior-based reactive control and action-oriented perception for mobile robots, that's a mouthful, and unmanned aerial vehicles, hybrid deliberative reactive software architectures, robot survivability, multi-agent robotic systems, biorobotics, human-robot interaction, robot ethics, and learning in autonomous systems. He has over 170 technical publications in these various areas. He's also written several books. Here are a few titles: Behavior-Based Robotics, Robot Colonies, and Governing Lethal Behavior in Autonomous Robots. Dr. Arkin has served as an associate editor for the IEEE Intelligence Systems, the International Journal of Social Robots, and the Journal of Environmentally Conscious Manufacturing, and is the series editor for the MIT Press book series, Intelligent Robotics and Autonomous Agents. He also serves as a consultant for several major companies in the area of intelligent robotic systems and has provided expert testimony to the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Pentagon, and others on autonomous systems technology. We are really lucky to have him with us tonight to speak on lethal autonomous robots and the plight of the non-combatant. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ron Arkin.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you so much. Can you hear me back there? Is it working okay? I'm going to take you on a little journey today through a crucially important issue that is affecting humanity now and in the near term. But part of it's my own little journey as well too through my life. I shared with some of the faculty here earlier how I got to be a roboticist. I'm not going to do that now, but what I'm going to share with you is how I got interested in robot ethics, first and foremost. And part of it is that I started robotics close to 30 years ago, actually probably over 30 years ago now. And it was a challenge in those days just to be able to get a robot to go across a room without crashing into anything. It's quite different now, as you may know, with the advent of autonomous driving cars, and some of you may have robot vacuum cleaners or a robot dog or something along those lines. More and more of that is happening. So the bottom line is that our research community as a whole is succeeding. And when you start to succeed at something, you have to pay attention to what the consequences of that research leads to. And so, as such, we have to accept responsibility for the artifacts, the science, and the technology that we're creating. Many of us who originally got into this field were driven by most scientists and technologists in curiosity-driven research. We wanted to know and understand, can we do this? What does it mean? And then think maybe later, should we have done that? Or what is it that we're doing? And I think this is an important question for all of you, certainly in the science and technology and engineering communities, for those of you who are interested. Well, so recognizing that, I had the opportunity to attend the first Robot and Ethics Symposium in 2004. This was held at Villa Nobel in San Remo, Italy. This was the house where Alfred Nobel died. It was organized by an Italian group. There were meetings there from the Pugwash Institute. Those are the Pugwash organization, which had the Russell Einstein Manifesto, which expressed the reservations and concerns of scientists such as Einstein after the nuclear weapons were created. The kind of, oh my God, what have we done? And how can we manage that? That's an important revelation. I also had folks from Geneva there. I can't recall if they were for the International Committee of the Red Cross or what have you, but I was a roboticist, remember, at this point in time. And I was getting lectured on, this is the right caliber of bullet to kill people with. Legal to kill people with. This is in warfare, keep in mind again as well too. I'm sitting there, I didn't know there was an illegal caliber bullet, but when you think about it, there is. Part of it is the slow fat bullets are the ones that are legal. The small high velocity bullets are not. And it has to do with the size of the exit wound, in the sense that you must be able to heal after you're shot if you're not shot dead at that particular point. It deals with a tenet underlying just war theory, which originates with St. Augustine, which I'm sure is, again, speaking at a place such as this, must resonate a little bit, although Benedict was not St. Augustine. Nonetheless, those sorts of things form the underpinnings of just war theory, which I'll refer to several times as well too. And there was a representative for the Vatican, a priest named Jose Galvan, who talked about technoethics, and he talked about humanoid robots. And are they good? Are they bad? Well, he said that if humanoids enhanced the human condition, they were good. If they replaced the human condition, they were not. It was an interesting position, not the official position of the Vatican, but it was an interesting statement at that particular point. Then I got motivated, I guess is a way to describe it. I started getting involved with our professional societies in electrical and computer and robotics engineering. I became a co-chair founding this technical committee in robot ethics, chaired the Human Rights and Ethics Committee. I got elected to the IEEE Social Implications of Technology Society on the Board of Governors. But secondly, or thirdly or fourthly, I don't know which it is, there was a video. I spent a lot of time interacting with the Department of Defense. I don't have a security clearance. I've never wanted a security clearance, so I can talk to you about anything that I do. But most US roboticists receive funding from the Department of Defense. In many cases, it's to do basic research. It's not to build weapon systems. I don't have any weaponized robots in my laboratory. They're just interested in the fundamental science. They'll figure out how to get it into the weapon systems on their own. They don't need me to do that. But that's what they do. At this meeting, there was a video playing in the background. It was subsequently found on the web. I don't show it, but I'll use it as an illustrative scenario a little bit later, which caused me some significant concern, not about how robots are being used, but how human behavior in the battlefield is, in some cases, fundamentally problematic. So that's what got me into this particular place. I didn't study ethics in the formal sense, but it led me through my career to this particular point. So what I want to talk about here is the notion of jus in bello, which is a just war component, which is after we find ourselves in war, what is the ethical way to fight? This is a component of just war theory. There's something called jus ad bellum as well too, which is what constitutes going to war in the first place. What is just war? When is war justified? A true pacifist, and I suspect some of you, if not many of you, are pacifists as well too, would say there is no true justification for ever going off to war. Quakers certainly feel that way as well. And there's certainly no reason to shoot other people even if you are in war under those circumstances. But our president, for example, won the Nobel Prize many years ago at the beginning of his first term for his adherence to just war theory. And most nations subscribe, 184 if I'm not mistaken, have signed on to the International Humanitarian Law, IHL as I'll refer to it from henceforth, in this notion of governing the way in which we treat each other in warfare. I will not be talking specifically about jus ad bellum, although there are some questions when we go to war, but rather what is the just way to fight wars, if any. So here's the real question that we're dealing with. There are two assumptions underlying my work, and one is that wars will continue. It's an unfortunate assumption, and for those of you who are pacifists, I urge you to make and invalidate that particular assumption, but all of history seems to indicate that it will continue. So I admire those who try. I'm working with the jus in bello side of things. So why is the military interested in robotics in the first place? Well, not for vacuum cleaners specifically. One is this notion of force multiplication. They want a war fighter, now that's men and women, to be able to do more than an individual soldier could potentially do. This is referred to as force multiplication. You like this, perhaps. If you lived through my era, there was a draft in the Vietnam era, and you didn't want to be drafted, most people, including myself. I have never served in the military, but I have consulted and worked with the military. But most people did not want to be drafted, and I suspect in our all-volunteer force, you would probably prefer that indeed be the case. That changed many people's lives, that draft during the Vietnam era, in ways that were perhaps unfortunate, if not definitely unfortunate. Another reason they want robotic systems is to expand the battle space. With these systems, they can conduct warfare over larger areas. Remember, this is what the military wants out of these particular systems. So you could have robots on persistent stare and long-term endurance over large areas of coastline or over Chinese sand islands that are being built up in the middle of the South China Sea, or just have patrolling the borders of Canada and Mexico as well too. Long-range endurance. People, if you had manned aircraft, people have to eat, people have to sleep, people have to pee, people have to do all these things, which kind of get in the way. Robots don't have to do those sorts of things. For the individual warfighter, they can both see further and strike further, which means that if, for example, a soldier in a very dangerous situation, what's called a building clearing operation, has to go into a house. If you saw Saving Private Ryan or something like that, you've seen these circumstances where you have to go in and get the bad guys out. Well, you might have to stick your head around a corner or stick your head into a room. That's a dangerous action, is it not? And if you could send a robot to do that, that might be helpful. If you could even, in some cases, potentially use a weapon to strike under those circumstances, you may become less at risk as well. And the net effect of all these things is reducing friendly casualties. But there has been little discussion until more recently about how artificial intelligence, AI, and robotics could potentially help reduce non-combatant casualties as well too. And that's the thing that drove me into this particular area. It's not about making the military more effective. It's protecting non-combatants better than they're currently protected. Here are some examples. Oops, of some system. Oh, let me try it again. I'll do it the hard way. I like this because it wakes up the audience a little bit. Our synthetic platforms, most of these are under direct human control, but they can be used for a variety of operations in a variety of different sets of circumstances. This is older technology. There's newer technology out there as well, too. They're used on the air, the ground, the sea, all sorts of different places. And I have to let you know that they are not only used by the United States. Many nations are developing and deploying these systems. Israel is probably number 2 in the development of these kinds of weaponized platforms as well, and are exporters of those to many other nations. China and Russia have developed. The newest Russia one is a robo-jeep, a weaponized robo-jeep to protect nuclear installations that they have as well too. There are all sorts of different things. This one is a fairly controversial one. It's called the LRASM. It's a Lockheed Martin cruise missile, which is much smarter than any other cruise missile. Cruise missiles are robots when you get down to it. They basically are able to sense and navigate and act on their own. And these ones have the ability to respond to what are called pop-up threats, where there may be a radar turned on where it wasn't before, navigate around that. And also, if its primary target isn't available, be able to pick from a set of secondary targets on its own without further human intervention. Part of the problem with these kinds of systems, if you have a human constantly controlling them, is they're subject to electronic countermeasures or jamming. And the links back to those people can be broken. So if your opponent or your adversary is able to break those links, what do? Go back home? Or are you going to give the robot the authority to carry out the mission on its own? Those are decisions that we as a nation, we as a world have to make. And if you want to go buy one, you can get one on the internet. I don't think that you could necessarily be able to import it into this particular country. But DODAM is you can't really read it here, but it says autonomous detection and autonomous engagement firing with safety as well too. So these are systems that are commercially available to different governments typically to be able to buy these kinds of systems. You could pick your weapons package, you could pick your number of tires and wheels and things like that as well too. Excuse me, most of these still have humans in the loop, but nonetheless, they are lethal weapon systems. From an older chart, this shows some of not only the robotics programs of the US, but these are the force-bearing, typically what's called kinetic force, the ability to project mass, which is firing a bullet or a shot or something like that. These are typical examples. You see some of the ones that you're familiar with, the Predator, the MQ-1, or the Reaper. There's new versions of that out, the Avenger and the like as well too. But there's many, many more. And these are the unclassified systems. I don't know what the classified systems are. I told you I don't have a security clearance, but there are many others as well too. So the real question is, what are we doing, right? What are we doing and how is this going to affect warfare? Is it going to end up being a complete and utter disaster, which some people say, or can it actually lead to better protection of civilians in the battle space? You see civilians being killed. Look at Aleppo. Good God. What's happening there? The slaughter, wholesale slaughter of civilians in warfare. And this happens in every war. It has always happened in every war. It's only relatively recently in the history of humanity been criminalized, although we have a really hard time being able to convict people of war crimes. But the status quo with respect to innocent civilian casualties is completely unacceptable. That's just a fact. I'm sorry, that's just a fact. We need to do something about that. And I do believe that technology can, should, and must play a role in reducing the civilian casualty rate as well. So this is the premise I'm going to argue for in this case, and showed some work that I did for the Army in this particular space, that if we do it right, we might be able to save lives. This is, for those of you taking ethics courses, which I think are some of you that are out there as well too, this is a consequentialist argument. There are those who will argue from a rights-based or deontological perspective against it as well too, and we'll share those things as we go through the evening with respect to that. Now, what's going on in the world with respect to these lethal autonomous weapon systems. This is the language that's being used. You may not be familiar with the fact that the United Nations in Geneva has been talking about this for 3 years. I attended the first experts meeting at the United Nations on this particular subject, but for 2 other years it's been going on, and it's going to be another continuation of this discussion in November, a month and a half from now as well too. When this first started, many NGOs, including Human Rights Watch or ICRAC, the International Committee on Robot Arms Control, have called for a preemptive ban on lethal autonomous weapons. And they have a great report called Losing Humanity. You might want to read about that as well too. The United States Department of Defense issued a directive just about that time. It was coincidental with that, which is a quasi-moratorium in my mind, saying that they basically are not going to develop certain classes of weapons for at least 10 years. And within 5 years, which actually is coming up relatively soon, they will review to see whether that should be extended or not. And others in the United Nations themselves, the Special Rapporteur has been considering this problem as well too. This is big news. 120 nations are members of what's called the CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapon Systems, which is charged with managing new weapon systems and considering either bans or regulations. For example, you may not be aware that lasers, blinding lasers, were banned a good number of years ago. You cannot blind people with lasers in the battlefield. If you do, you will be a war criminal. You can shoot them in the eye, but you can't blind them with a laser. And I will not pretend that IHL always makes sense, but that's just a fact. So discussions are going on with how to address these systems. And the biggest problem thus far has been definitional. Many people say these systems don't exist yet at all. Other folks, such as myself, say, having worked in autonomous systems for a long time, by at least a roboticist definition, they do exist. Now, autonomy itself is a funny word. For a philosopher, autonomy typically means free will or moral agency, that you bear the responsibility for the actions that you undertake. A roboticist doesn't believe a robot is any time in the near term or midterm going to bear its own responsibility for its own actions. That requires a different level of consciousness, which many of us aren't ready to even come close to attributing that. But in this case, when we're referring to autonomy, we're saying a robot will make a decision based on pre-programmed information to act in response to sensory information. And in some cases, that control pattern has been laid out, in all cases, has been laid out by a human being, but it will choose according to those rules and guidelines that it was given earlier by under human control. And the other phrase that is problematic, which has come up recently in these discussions, is something called meaningful human control. Okay, what does that really mean? What does meaningful human control mean? Everyone wants meaningful human control. To me, no meaningful human control is the Terminator. I don't think anyone wants to build the Terminator, right? What would be? That's not a good example of a robotic system that is working for the military. It's trying to destroy everything for everybody. But is a warfighter, for example, a soldier that you command to go and take a building using whatever force is necessary under meaningful human control? You have delegated authority to that individual to carry out a particular task. You delegate authority when you use a Roomba in your floor to vacuum your floor. You say, vacuum my floor. Hopefully you won't trip me up, or vacuum up the cat, or something along those lines. But you have delegated authority to it. At what level is meaningful human control? These terms are really obfuscating the entire discussion, making it difficult to come to grips. Some of it is motivated by fear, some of it is motivated by lack of definitions, but I think all of us are genuinely concerned about the future. And the question is, what is the right future for this? Some early work in another report talked about the military considering the fact that the decision to fire will not likely be fully automated until legal rules of engagement and safety concerns have all been thoroughly examined and resolved. That states two things. It says, we're not going to do it, yet we may do it at that particular point. That was earlier. And then when they pointed that out, they started not saying that any longer. But the Air Force, if you saw, this went out to 20 34. This is the roadmap because it was mostly for ground-based systems, but the Air Force has a flight plan because that's what they do. They go out, 2034 wasn't good enough for them. They went out to 2047. What kind of plan is good for 2047? Come on. I mean, we can't plan that far out into the future. But the important thing to recognize is this shows long-term commitment to this particular type of unmanned autonomous technology. Whether they can plan or not, I don't know. I think that's kind of ridiculous. But here, these are the things. They said it's contingent upon making political and military leaders resolving legal and ethical questions. These questions and discussions are going on right now, worldwide. And again, must take place in the near term, rather than allow the development. That's your nation, most of you, I suppose, those of you from the United States, are stating that. This is the most recent thing I found. This I just found in July as well, too. And it talks about something called the Joint Operating Environment, which isn't the same kind of document as you saw there, but it talks about new and powerful robotic systems to perform complex actions, make autonomous decisions, deliver lethal force. And most significantly, at the bottom line there, they are concerned with our adversaries. They talk about autonomous lethal decision-making capabilities that adversaries are more likely to employ. So we're not just worried about how we're going to use it, we're worried about how it's going to be used against us. So can you put the genie back in the bottle? I mean, is this the Russell Einstein Manifesto? Are we creating artificial intelligence, which is, some would say in a broader sense, is going to lead to the demise of all humanity? Or is this going to exacerbate the horrors of war over what it currently is? Well, I would say it depends. And we need to make sure it doesn't, one way or the other. So regarding this regulation, I have always stated I'm not averse to a ban if we aren't able to achieve this particular goal of reducing civilian casualties. And I'm not in favor of a blank check to do whatever you want with autonomous systems under any circumstances. They need to be regulated, they need to be controlled, they need to be used in appropriate circumstances. And I have argued instead of a preemptive ban, a moratorium is the right thing to do. And if we can achieve that goal of reducing non-combatant casualties, saving lives, that argues that it's a moral imperative. Very much like what Human Rights Watch argued for in the context of the use of precision-guided munitions in urban settings. They said if you have precision-guided munitions in a war and you're dropping bombs in a city, you better use precision-guided munitions and not dumb bombs, like unfortunately it seems the Russians are doing in their combat. You need to be able to laser guide those things down. And to me, autonomous systems, perhaps like this, are the next generation of precision-guided munitions. But we need to regulate them, and we need to have rational discussions, not based on fear. And God knows how many pictures of the Terminator I've seen associated with every press release that is associated with this, which again blurs the thing. So this is the question. Can we use this technology to reduce criminal events? And yes, human warfighters, many heroic, but also a significant number stray outside the bounds of international humanitarian law and result in civilian casualties, either through deliberate atrocities or just sheer carelessness or out of fear. All of these things are inherent in the human condition. And we might find that robots can potentially do better. And these are some of the secondary effects which affect the military in terms of, I hate to say it, but given what George Bush did on the aircraft carrier, mission accomplished, whatever mission accomplished may mean, but to be able to accomplish a mission. The whole goal of the military is to accomplish a specific mission, independent of what the president happens to say. My second assumption, I told you the first, warfare will continue. My second assumption is that lethal autonomy is inevitable. Why do I say that? Well, I say it because it already exists, at least by my definitions. How can it not be here if it already exists? And there are many systems, such as cruise missiles, which to me is a robotic system. The Navy Phalanx Aegis-class cruisers, where a captain turns on a switch into auto mode operation, and if anything comes in fast at a particular target, matching a particular target signature, It doesn't ask the captain, should I shoot? Because if it asks the captain, should I shoot? And it waits to hear from the captain, should I shoot? Because that's a supersonic sea-skimming missile coming at that ship is destroyed by the time you get that particular answer. So you have to go to that particular decision-making, where it's so-called the decision-making is being pushed more and more towards the tip of the spear, to use military jargon. The decisions are being made faster and faster, and this is a consequence of, yes, computing technology. We are able to sense and act far faster than we ever did before, and that affects the way in which we fight wars. And some people argue we should slow down warfare. I remember the old days, and Gettysburg and the like as well too. The rifled bullet actually changed the slaughter that occurred in the Civil War, which is a technological change which tactics didn't address, so people marched into, but actually when you shot at something, instead of the old ball, which didn't get hit, lucky if you hit the side of a barn with those things, rifle bullets actually went where you aimed. Technology is changing as well too. So this whole notion of human in the loop and the fallibility of human decision making is forcing decisions to be made by machines in warfare. So maybe it's a good idea not to go into warfare in the first place. I'm all for that, okay? I just don't know how to make that not happen. Maybe one of you do, so please help. So here's the question I put. This is a purely rhetorical question, okay? You aren't supposed to answer. Should soldiers be robots? What do we do when we train soldiers? We train them to not fear, we train them to obey, we train them to respond in the absence of stress and anger, or in the presence of stress, but respond rationally. We kind of dehumanize them to some extent. People naturally abhor killing. It's incredibly difficult to make someone kill another human being. You have to be trained to do that. And actually, only a relatively small percentage of human beings are capable of doing that. And there's interesting studies. I've studied, as was mentioned, bio-robotic systems for a long time. I study animals in their natural environment. And unfortunately, one of the most depressing things I've studied is the human behavior in the battlefield as well. And it's hard to make people kill, but people kill, and many other soldiers act as support mechanisms for the individual who's doing that. It's a very odd structure, not what you'd normally think, but when you study it and you spend your time reading depressing books like Killing Civilians and things of that sort, you learn something, and it's worth the investment, but it's not pleasant at all. And so then the question is, should robots be soldiers? Could they do better? Could they even be more humane than human beings are? Could we create robots that are more humane? Is it that hard to imagine? Think how badly we treat each other under many circumstances, warfare especially. Could we create these robots to do better than human beings? I'm not saying we can. I said, should we study that particular question? Here are examples of all kinds of things that have gone wrong, unnecessary deaths. You can see it even in policing forces as well too, happening on a seemingly daily basis right now with Black Lives Matter movements and the like as well too. Haditha, take your pick. That's just US. It's everywhere. It's in every war. The only thing is it's being covered now better than before. It's happened in every war. Atrocities, slaughter, rape, everything. Bad stuff happens in war. It's plain and simple. No one says that war is a good thing. Well, maybe somebody does, I don't know, but it's not. These are just examples, and it's not local, it's in every conflict. Some examples here with the violations of international humanitarian law, the defiling of corpses, Sergeant Bale who went and started killing civilians because he wanted to on his own, all sorts of things. But the important thing for the military is it actually puts your fellow service members at risk as well too. It's a bad thing for the military because it reduces troop morale, it puts different soldiers at risk. All these sorts of things are potentially problematic. The United States did a remarkable thing in 2006. It actually documented the ethical behavior of soldiers in the battlefield. On the return of these from Operation Iraqi Freedom, the Surgeon General compiled a scientific report, a scientific study, looking at their mental health and their ethical behavior. They obviously didn't ask them, did you commit a war crime? That would not get a good answer. They weren't looking for confessions of guilt. But these numbers are very disturbing. Simple things like 17% of soldiers and Marines agreed or strongly agreed that all non-combatants should be treated as insurgents. There's no difference. You're either a bad guy or you're a good guy. 45% of soldiers and 60% of Marines did not agree that they would report a fellow soldier or Marine if he had injured or killed an innocent non-combatant. That's a war crime right there. They might not have known that when they were answering that question, but you have to report a war crime when it occurs. This is the band of brothers effect. You cover for your buddy who's at risk. And this is a natural, inherent weakness in human beings and in human warfighters. And the list goes on and on. They wouldn't report for an unethical behavior. They were not properly trained. That's an interesting read if you have a chance to take a look at it as well too. And it's the first time, to our nation's credit, and it's a benchmark that any nation has examined scientifically the ethical behavior. There have been some informal sociological studies that said in World War II, in the Vietnam War, 100% of all men in heavy combat, 33%, if I remember the numbers correctly, look at my writings to get the exact numbers, in medium combat, and I believe 17% in light combat had either witnessed, abetted, or committed an atrocity. That's incredible. You know how many soldiers are over there? You know what those percentages are? You know what that means? That means we as human beings fail in the battlefield. And it's not a surprise. And it's getting worse. Remember I told you the technology is going faster and faster and faster, and the decisions are getting harder and harder and harder to make on a rational basis. These are some of the reasons why people commit war crimes. A whole bunch of different reasons there as well too. Revenge, anger, all sorts of different things. In some cases, just pleasure. You don't have to build robots to get pleasure out of killing. So, this is the question I ask my colleagues. Do we as scientists have a responsibility to find ways to reduce this problem of inhumanity using technology? The military wants to win wars, okay? And they want to comply with international humanitarian law because they have to comply with international humanitarian law. They're criminals themselves. But should we really try to do better? And I believe that we can. So as I mentioned before, we have to consider the fact that these robots will not only make a decision when to fire, but they will make a decision when not to fire. Imagine, for example, you had a cruise missile that was launched. It takes maybe 30 minutes or more after the launch of that cruise missile to get to its target. Conditions on the ground could have changed substantially. You guys probably, I don't know how long ago it was, shock and awe, if your parents let you stay up that late, I guess, to watch that, when the bridges were being blown out in, was it Baghdad at that point? Well, you launch that, but no situational awareness occurs. Are there a bunch of people standing on the bridge at that point in time? Are there a line of school buses on that? Are you going to give the authority to the robot to make a decision not to fire? It's not just choosing to fire, it's choosing not to fire. That's what autonomy is about. Autonomy is not only making a decision to kill, it's about making a decision not to kill when given an order to kill. Are you going to trust that to a robot? I trust that to an airplane almost every day. I get an airplane as well too. You don't need a pilot up there anymore to fly that thing unless you have a Sully type of event. Under those circumstances, the heroism and creativity of a human being can far exceed the capabilities. But if you look at most airplane crashes, why do they occur? Human error, right? Somebody screwed up somewhere along the way. Well, people die in battlefield because people screw up along the way. And we need to find ways to be able to address this, but also not make people completely out of the loop, so to speak. Allow human overrides at different levels of capacity to be able to abort missions or do something different as necessary. Okay, so this was the research thesis that underlay the work I did for the Army Research Office, that we can have, they could be more humane is another way of stating it, but they can comply better with IHL. Keep in mind I say comply better. They will not be perfectly ethical. There will not be perfect compliance. Period. These systems will not be perfect. But can they do better than humans? If they can do better than humans, should they be used? I'll let you decide that. I have my opinion on that as well too, but consequentialism would argue probably yes. If we can save lives, we should save lives. That's a consequentialist argument. We'll talk about some of the deontological counter-arguments in a bit. So the way in which I approach this, and I'm not going to go into technicalities associated with this, but we gave the robot the right of refusal of an order. That's not always looked at as a good thing, especially from the military. Remember the movie, Sorry Dave, I Can't Do That? That's not necessarily a positive response under all circumstances. They can also observe the behavior of others. You talk about, was it police cams, body cams and the like as well too, the cops are wearing. If you got these robots out there with cameras going full time, watching not only their own behavior, but the behavior of everyone in the battle space, that provides evidence for war crimes, if appropriate. And try not to incorporate all the existing laws and conventions, which in some cases are relatively vague, but for a particular narrow situation. It's something referred to as bounded morality. Don't try and incorporate all of human morality into these systems. That's impossible, anytime in the near, midterm, or whatever. If you believe in the singularity, that machine intelligence will exceed human intelligence, then sure, we'll be able to do it. But I'm not expecting to see that anytime soon, or in my lifetime, or maybe in your lifetime as well. But there are certain things we can incorporate with respect to these systems. And when I first started this work, this was kind of it was a great article, but it was kind of tongue-in-cheek picture showing what I was trying to do. Here's the Predator. It said, where do we plug in the ethics upgrade, or how do we plug in the ethics upgrade? I want these systems to be able to not shoot when it's inappropriate to shoot, or to be able to pick a better target, or to be able to pick a better course or engagement of the target than otherwise. Why am I optimistic this can be done? A whole bunch of reasons. AI has been progressing in leaps and bounds, as you probably know. Some of you may have heard about new technologies called deep learning, which is actually a little worrisome from some aspects because it's a non-transparent way of machine learning, as powerful as it is. Go, many of you may know the game Go. Most difficult board game by most people. AI just beat the best Go player in the world. Using a hybrid version, incorporating deep learning and the like as well too. Autonomous cars, we got them driving around Pittsburgh now, we got them driving in Singapore. Uber is investing a ton of money in this. It's incredible how fast this has come out since the DARPA Grand Challenge and the work in DARPA has been investing. If you go way back, it was actually in the 70s when this research started, but the progress of late has been dramatic. And it's not only the AI technologies, it's the advances in sensors, it's the advances in actuators and materials and all these other things that are making this change. The second aspect of this is that we have to understand that this isn't for every single circumstance. There are certain cases where it might pay off in the sense of reducing civilian casualties. One of those, of course, is in situations where there are low likelihood of encounter of civilians. So that says not in counterinsurgency types of operations, which we have been engaged with a lot lately. But you can imagine in high-intensity interstate warfare, do I have that here? High-intensity interstate warfare. God forbid we should get into one of those again, but you can imagine, unfortunately, situations that may potentially lead to that. I do not want to predict dystopian future, but part of DARPA and the military is to prevent surprise, and the development of technology is an assistance in that. And for certain types of missions as well too, again, this notion of bound to morality. I talked about room clearing operations, Haditha, for example. I don't know if you remember that from Iraq, where people were very angry because one of their friends was killed. They went into a building, rolled grenades through doors. In one version of the story, there were women and children in those rooms. They didn't appropriately clear and check the rooms before, and innocent women and children died. There's robotic technology you can do, I believe, that can solve this problem, which is incredibly high risk to humans. And it's easy to say, yeah, they should have opened the door and looked inside first before they threw those grenades in. But It's easy to say, and it's really challenging to be able to do. But it shouldn't be act out of anger in any case, as they did apparently. And other things, counter-sniper operations and in the demilitarized zone. I have a few scenarios I'll share with you in the remaining few minutes that we have. So these are the reasons why I believe that ethical autonomy can work. One is robots can assume far more risk on behalf of a non-combatant than any human in their right mind would possibly do. There is no reason for them to have fear of their own destruction. Why would you program that in this particular case? They can take on risk and demand higher levels of target identification than any human being possibly would deal with. There's two notions in what I call the standing rules of engagement, engaging a target. One is that target has to show either hostility or hostile intent. Hostile intent's pretty hard to tell. Hostility is easier if someone is shooting at you. You can understand it under those circumstances. They will have, I believe, better sensors to penetrate the fog of war than humans currently do. They can be designed without anger, fear, frustration, all the sorts of things that cloud the judgment of human beings. There are certain cognitive problems that people have in disregarding incoming evidence. If you're told you believe something is going to happen, you may believe it's going to happen no matter what evidence comes in after that. It's a form of cognitive closure. It's just a characteristic of human beings to have. And the processing of this information from far more sources in an interneted battle space where sensors are everywhere can be done far more quicker and potentially far more effectively from different vantage points to make better decisions. And further, as I mentioned before, they can potentially independently and objectively monitor the battle space with respect to human bad behavior, which may be, again, inadvertent carelessness or the literal commitment of atrocities. Well, obviously this point of view has not gone unchallenged. There are many aspects of that. These are a few. Actually, these are all, this is my current list of counter-arguments. One is the notion of responsibility. I have good arguments against all these. I don't have time to go in depth with those, but I'll be happy to speak to them later in question and answer if you have things. The responsibility one I talked to earlier, the only paper I ever wrote a punctuation mark in other than a semicolon was, the robot didn't do it, period. I put a period there. You can't blame the robot any more than you can blame a precision-guided munition if it lands on a mosque. It's not the bomb's fault that it landed there. It's not the robot's fault that it did it. A human being is ultimately responsible for these actions. This notion of jus ad bellum violation is another one. Are we more likely to engage in adventurism? Are we more likely to go off into war if we create this technology? Maybe. But if we do research in any form of asymmetric advantage in military technology, whether it's cyber warfare or any of these other forms of new weaponized systems, let alone lethal autonomous weapons, that problem raises its head. So the alternative is to abandon all military research into technology. Good luck with that, especially since our nation has such an advantage over all others at this point in time. Some just say it can't be done right. This notion of risk-free warfare, well, one could argue it's not ever really risk-free, but there is an asymmetric advantage. This effect on the squad, again, if this robot's going to tell on you if you committed an atrocity, are you going to frag it like you used to do in Vietnam and kill the commander or kill the robot because it's going to tell on you? Or are you going to change your culture, recognizing that this robot is going to go out in front of you and allow you to be safer behind it, and it may be able to watch your back better than Joe or Jill can watch your back as well too. This notion of Terminator vision and the like, whatever, we can talk about that if you like. Refusing an order, the military is not necessarily happy about that, but you have to provide explanations as to why. The overrides in wrong hands, some say that just doing this is an effort by the military to justify what they're going to do anyway. The notion of winning hearts and minds, if you're killed by a robot, or if your parents are killed by a robot, does that alienate you more than if you had a bunch of contractors kill your parents the same way? I don't know. The problem of proliferation is potentially very real. These are easy systems to build, actually. You can go down to Radio Shack. Our students have done this. Not created lethal autonomous weapons, but have shown the capability of doing this. By going down to Radio Shack, you buy a RC-controlled aircraft, you mount a cell phone on it, you do GPS waypoint following to a particular location, you can do target identification algorithms on the, even face recognition if you can really get a good view of an individual, and you could potentially engage accordingly. This is pretty frightening when you think about how easy this is to do domestically as well, let alone over other nations. Hezbollah has used drones in their attacks against Israel in the past, but they were whacked out of the sky with the wingtips of Israeli fighters. Countermeasures will start to be a role. Others have hacked into these systems, such as the University of Texas. They broke into a Predator, a state ground station as well too. But part of that is the fact that we're fighting against a relatively unsophisticated enemy in Iraq and Afghanistan at this point in time. So the data is not as encrypted at full levels to have high bandwidth return, which is necessary for the kinds of information that they're trying to do. So it's a risk-benefit situation. The one that perhaps worries me the most is mission creep. What does that mean? Mission creep. It means that when you build a robot to do a particular task, our warfighters are really smart. And this robot has been built to do this, but they can figure a way to make it do something different. A classic example is in Peter Singer's book, Wired for War, where he talks about a IED robot, which they put a Claymore mine on, drove it around the corner, and used the arm to blow up the Claymore mine and kill a insurgent on the other side. The robot wasn't designed to do that. It wasn't supposed to be a lethal system. It was supposed to deal with improvised explosive devices along the roadside. But our warfighters are smart people. They will use it in ways which may perhaps stray outside international humanitarian law. So if you're going to build a system, the kind of things that you need to incorporate are those that are central to international humanitarian law. These are the four underlying principles. One, military necessity. You have to have a reason to kill somebody, to engage a target. You can't just do it because you want to. There has to be something that provides military advantage in that case. You have to do it in a way that doesn't produce unnecessary suffering. You have to use, in proportionality, the correct amount of force and no more to be able to engage that target. That's why you can't drop nuclear weapons, or well, there's many reasons why you can't drop nuclear weapons, but you can't drop much bigger explosives out, and you have to be able to discriminate or distinguish combatants from non-combatants. The last one can be hard, especially in current circumstances where people hide among civilians. The long, rich history of the legislation of this, and actually for someone who's trying to encode ethics in a system, this is relatively easy. This is what I call the low-hanging fruit, because people have been thinking about this for thousands of years and encoding it for a couple of hundred now, almost 150 or so, in different ways, and saying this is what's acceptable and this is what's not acceptable. Think about that in business ethics. What do you get? You get virtue ethics, right? Be good. Basically what they say. Be good. I don't know how to tell a robot to be good. I can tell a robot, don't shoot a non-combatant, but I don't know how to tell it to be good. There are people actually working on telling robots and learning eudaimonia, for those of you who studied Aristotelian virtue ethics and the like, and maximizing eudaimonia on that, and I wish them well in those particular cases, but that's a different approach to this problem. But these things are relatively well written out, and again, using this notion of bounded morality, where it's only in certain circumstances, it makes it easier. Using a variant of deontic logic, which is a logic of permissions, prohibitions, and obligations, we can encode these things in terms of obligations and prohibitions in this particular case. And the bottom line is there must be an obligation generated by a human being embedded in the robotic system to attack a target. It came from a human being. And it must not violate any of the prohibitions before you can actually engage that particular target. Those have to be checked. And the system is not granted permission to fire until that is done. There are many ways in which we've incorporated this. We've used even emotions in some cases, such as guilt. We use responsibility advisors. We have architectures and theoretical expressions of this and analysis that works its way through here. And fortunately, there are others working in this space, but it's still a relatively small community studying this particular problem. It's hard. How do you make a robot ethical? How do you make a human being ethical? How do you do that? For those of you who have kids, you know it's not always the easiest thing. For those of you who have yourselves, which is most of us, it's still not always the easiest thing to behave ethically as well, too. Might be easier to make a robot behave ethically. That's what I'm saying here, okay? I'm saying it may be easier to make a robot behave ethically than to make a human being behave ethically. And these are some examples of the kinds of things that we did with overrides. My papers, if you're interested in this in my book, incorporate the details of that. I'm not going to belabor that in this audience. But I will move to a few examples and scenarios right now. And let's move to the first one.
We have a story tonight that has to do with a single photograph. It's a surveillance photo taken in Afghanistan and obtained exclusively by NBC News. It's a photo of a gathering of Taliban fighters, but some say it shows more than that. Some say it shows what was a perfect opportunity to take out the enemy, but the military was unable to take the shot. The question is why? It was NBC News correspondent Kerry Sanders who obtained this photo exclusively. He reports for us tonight from Kabul.
Brian, it took 5 days for the U.S. military to consider my request to declassify the photograph. It's a grainy still image that shows what some here in Afghanistan say was a lost opportunity to inflict serious damage on the Taliban.
Army intelligence officers say the photo shows 190 members of the Taliban at a funeral 2 months ago. The U.S. Army claims among those in the formation, high-ranking members of the Taliban leadership. An unmanned armed predator like this one was spying on the group. Intelligence officers monitoring the scene in real time wanted to fire. They asked permission. The request went to intelligence analysts, senior commanders, and lawyers. Intelligence officers were told no, they were not allowed to fire. Why? U.S. rules of engagement do not permit waging war in a cemetery.
That was frustrating. Those individuals live to fight another day, potentially could cause harm to our soldiers, civilians, the population of government Afghanistan.
Despite frustration, U.S. military leaders here say the decision not to fire was the right one.
Meantime, the Taliban fight by their own rules. On Monday,
We have a story.
So what do you think of that? Was that the right decision? It was a human decision? Yeah, it was the right decision because the rules of engagement, if those were the rules of engagement, by the way, rules of engagement are typically classified, so you wouldn't know if that's a rule of engagement or not. But imagine, let's just transpose to 150 Taliban at the top of a hospital or praying in a mosque. Those are structures that are protected by international humanitarian law. You cannot drop a bomb on them there, period. It's as simple as that. You can't do it. It's a crime. You're a war criminal if you do it. If they're shooting at you or if they're misusing it, that's a different story. I'm not sure if cemeteries are protected property in the general sense or not, but just imagine in a different circumstance. Could we do that today? Could I program, maybe not me personally, but could we program that system, fire control and that, to say that here are GPS coordinates, which is a no-fire zone. You want to push that button to fire in that zone. These are GPS coordinates that say it's a no-fire zone. What do? You don't fire. You don't have to ask a lawyer. You don't have to go up the chain of command, ask your boss. You can say, I wish we could fire. Well, go change the rules of engagement or commit a war crime but the robot's not going to do it. I don't want the robot to take that shot under those circumstances, if those are the rules. That's a simple fix. That can be done tomorrow. Next. This is the video that helped get me into this space. I'm not showing the video. It's rather gruesome. What it deals with is an Apache helicopter, manned Apache helicopter, which are remarkably silent when off from a distance, looking at 3 folks, I'll call them insurgents, planting improvised explosive devices by the side of the road. That makes them at least according to everything it appears, legitimate targets. Okay? They're showing hostile intent in this particular case. So they are legitimate targets. What happens here? Okay, this first guy, the Apache helicopter, is far off, they can't hear it. Apache helicopters are equipped with what are called chain guns. Chain guns fire mini cannon shells, which means they explode when they hit the ground. And they do it at a very fast rate. So they engaged the first one, and in my discussions with the military on this, I learned the correct word to use to what happened was that individual was neutralized. It looked a whole lot worse than neutralization to me, but that was the phrase that was used. Okay, maybe that was a legitimate target. I'll assume it's a legitimate target. Probably was a legitimate target. The guy was ready, trying to kill our troops, showing hostility. Second guy was there. He looked kind of frozen at that point in time, as you might be as well too. If you're standing there like a deer in the headlights, what just happened? Well, gunner moved the sights, took out that individual. Seemed like a compliant act under those circumstances. Third guy finally said to himself, I imagine, something bad is not happening. I'm going to crawl under the truck at this point in time. So he crawled under the truck, which was over there. This is where this transcript starts. Voice one is believed to be the pilot. I don't know. We don't know exactly who it is. But these videos are called either brag videos or war porn, which are come back from the battlefield. They even put their names and the titles on this one as well, too. Voice one is believed to be the pilot. Voice two is the commander or the other one, but not the... it was remotely located. So voice one says, want me to take the other truck out. This is the guy in charge of the gun. The other truck is a legitimate target. It's war materiel. It can be engaged with a chain gun and neutralized. And then voice two, Roger. Wait for, I forgot to mention that the guy fired by the side of the truck with a chain gun as well too. The guy was under the truck. He targeted to the side of the truck. Remember, this is a cannon firing as well too with exploding shells. And he says, wait for move by the truck. Voice one, movement right there. So he saw movement. Roger, he's wounded. This fellow crawled out from under the truck, went about 5 meters, and collapsed on the ground. Okay? He was clearly wounded. He was stated to be wounded by the pilot, by the gunner at this point in time. Without any hesitation, the commander says, hit him. The gunner says, targeting the truck. The voice two, the commander says, hit the truck and him. Go forward of it and hit him. The gunner retargets for the wounded man, and then there's an audible weapons discharge, and the wounded man has been killed. What's the right answer? Okay, it's not a homework question. This is a real-life scenario. What should the robot do if that was a robot? Well, I presented this many times to JAG lawyers, military lawyers as well too, and I asked them, would you want my robot to take that shot? And all of them except one, and this one, well, very late in this discussion, late in the career, all of them except one, and I can't tell you who it is because of Chatham House rules and other things of that sort as well too. But it was a high-powered individual, said no. Keep in mind again, suppose you're on the ground now, okay? You had a gun in your hand, okay? And I commanded that soldier, you commanded that soldier, kill him. Does it make a difference if it's half a mile away? Some would argue that's potentially a summary execution, which is illegal. The Geneva Conventions say that for the wounded, you have an obligation to provide as good health care for them as you would for your own troops after they have been declared wounded, or what's referred to as hors de combat, in terms of wounded or surrendered. You have an obligation to do that. That was not done. Even if this individual, there were people going to take him away, you have to let them take him away. You can't kill wounded people. They attain the status of non-combatants at that particular point, even if they were enemy combatants prior. Should the robot take that shot? Topic for your class tomorrow. I'll leave that for those of you who are addressing that. This is another system. This is one in newer versions of this have been deployed in the border between North Korea and South Korea. Developed initially by Samsung Techwin. It can see, this older version could see 5 kilometers away in daytime, 2 kilometers at night using thermal vision. The machine gun couldn't shoot that far, but it could do that. And there you have it. This is a location where there is declared war. War exists in the demilitarized zone. There's an armistice, but there's still a state of war. Okay? These two countries have not signed the peace accords. They basically signed an armistice, which means we're not going to shoot at each other, sort of, evidently, but that's kind of what they say. There's a line through the middle of the demilitarized zone. You can see where the dot, I don't know if you saw it, but you can see the dot on the head of that individual. This has an auto mode operation. You can turn it on and shoot that individual. There's a line in the DMZ called the military demarcation line, which if you cross, you can be shot. Simple as that. There were signs saying, civilians, stay away from here or you will be shot. Is this a legitimate use of force for autonomous platforms in a war zone where civilians are told to stay out? How do you slow down the North Korean army if they suddenly decide to come through? Robotic technology may play a role in that. South Korea is investigating that. And there's other circumstances such as in counter-sniper operations. I like this one because we've done some work down at Fort Benning on a military operation over urban technology. There is technology right now which if you hear a sniper, the robot can slew a gun to that particular target based on both the auditory sound, the muzzle report, and the muzzle flash. You can put a gun or a weapon on that particular point. But a human is required to release that. And there's two things that can happen there. It can become like whack-a-mole and the human doesn't do good diligence and just says, okay, I'm going to blow it up, and maybe that's not the guy. Or it can do due diligence, and guess what happens? It's kind of like a cockroach, just run away by that point in time. It's a different location, so you will not engage that particular target. If you give the authority to a robot, maybe it can do it. Maybe. I'm not saying it can, I'm saying maybe. There's many other results showing these scenarios on our laboratory and videos. I'm not going to show those here, but they describe the work. If you're interested, you can find them off of our webpage. There are many questions which remain to be asked before we get to this particular point. Lots of research has to be done. This is not something that's ready for prime time tomorrow. We're talking maybe 10 to 20 years of solid research by a large community before it can be done. But there's many unanswered questions at this point in time. But that doesn't mean those questions aren't worth pursuing if they can save lives. So recognizing this fact that it's not only the United States, but others that are looking at ethical algorithms, but you can't tell people how you're going to fight. Because as soon as you tell them how you fight, they can exploit that as a weakness. So much of the stuff is no doubt in the classified domain. So if you've hated everything that you've heard tonight, the good news is there's something in international humanitarian law which is called the Martens Clause, which means basically if you hate everything you heard tonight and you could say it violates the dictates or the requirements of the public conscience, then you can say it's illegal and it can't be used. You don't have to do any other justification. You don't have to show it violates IHL. Although this clause has been included in IHL from the very beginning, it has never been used because most people can't, just as we've had trouble with definitions, what does it mean? How do I show it violates the dictates of the public conscience? But that's a tack that some of the those calling for ban are using as well too. So you can join that particular aspect as well. So bottom line again, or top line in this case, is we need to do something to better protect civilians in the battle space. And technology is one of the tools which we can do that, especially given the failings of human beings. I argue for a moratorium, and if we can save non-combatant lives doing it, then we should do it that way as well too. If you want more information, those are some of the sources for you. I thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'll do my best to try and answer them. Thank you.
So when it comes to the acknowledgement that these systems are not going to be perfect and there's going to be mistakes made, you mentioned that there's an accountability issue of who we're going to hold accountable for when these mistakes are made. Is there any sort of progress on that of what kind of decisions have been made in the past with something like this? Is it the person who decides not to intervene with the machine, or the person who programmed it and missed some sort of ethical issue in the programming?
That's a very good question, and they will make mistakes, as I've clearly stated as well, and innocent lives will still be lost using this particular technology. The best examples I can give, again, deal with potential failures in precision-guided munitions. Suppose, for example, you are trying to take out a legitimate target and a bomb lands on a school or a mosque or something like that, which is clearly a criminal act. And we've seen these things happen in the past. The real question is what happened? Did the guy who was lasing that target deliberately, it has to be deliberately, lays that target on the school to destroy it? Because there's intention. War crimes require intentional killing of civilians. It is not a war crime, as sad as it sounds, to kill civilians. It is a war crime to kill civilians intentionally. Even based on something called the principle of double effect, which dates back to the Middle Ages, even if civilians are going to die, it has to be weighed against the military advantage. And it's an unfortunate thing, but you cannot kill them for the sake of killing civilians. But if someone did that, and you could prove intentionality, then that individual would be responsible. If someone deliberately bent a fin, for example, on a precision-guided munition, so it would go off target, potentially you could charge that individual. If a commander continued to use a weapon that they knew was not performing up to specifications in the battle space, and it landed on the school, that individual could be culpable. If the manufacturer, for whatever reasons, whether it was just part specifications were not adhered to, that individual could be liable. It switches over to civilian liability at some point as opposed to military liability in war crimes. If the programmer was equally negligent without adequate testing and validation, or intentionally put in malicious code that would cause it to, whenever it saw a school, it would divert in that particular path. And stranger things have happened in code, as we know. That individual could be held potentially responsible. But the legal framework, especially on the software side, is wrestling with this in many different cases. And this deals with the Tesla and self-driving cars and everything right now. There are whole conferences and meetings with lawyers that are wrestling with these things on autonomous systems, not only in the military scenario. So accountability is crucially important, as is responsibility. But I will stick to my point, is the robot didn't do it. And the question is, how do you finally, ultimately ascribe that to an individual human? And then find enough evidence to be able to attribute that in a war crimes tribunal in these particular cases is still a challenging task.
In the history of the human race, it's an accepted tenet that the farther we can get away from our enemy and still kill them, the easier, the less value a human life has, the easier it is to make war. Yet you say this, why do you think this technology and this advancement is going to operate, any differently?
I didn't say it would be any different. You're correct about the use of standoff weaponry, which probably started with human beings first throwing stones at each other, then inventing the bow and arrow, and then inventing artillery, and then inventing long-range bombers, and then inventing cruise missiles, and now potentially using these kinds of things. Standoff killing does potentially inure human beings to the horror of violence, although if you actually talk to some of the UAV operators that fly these planes, at least they attest that they are well aware of the slaughter that they are occurring on the ground, and in some cases see it more clearly than, say, an artillery commander would launching a shell 20 miles away at a particular target. Standoff weaponry does provide asymmetric advantage. That's why the military is interested in this. And I'm not saying that this technology unrestrained is the way to go. What I'm saying is, if you could make that artillery shell sufficiently smart to recognize before it hit that particular point that this is not a legitimate target, or this is not a legitimate thing to engage, and thus blow off its fuse and not engage that, wouldn't that be an improvement over existing warfare? If you could consider any improvement an improvement over existing warfare. That would be my counter argument in that particular case.
Has there been any talk about revising the IHL with the idea of robots improving the capabilities of weapons? For example, the Apache Rules of the Night video, I would argue that a robot wouldn't.
I'm sorry, what was that last part?
The Apache Rules of the Night video,
Yeah.
I would argue that a robot wouldn't have missed, so there wouldn't have been a wounded combatant in the first place. So has there been talk about revising the IHL with that in mind, potentially allowing other weapons that are more lethal
Yeah.
because they could be employed more accurately or effectively?
First point, I think the robot still would have missed under those circumstances, just to be clarity, because the guy was hiding under the truck, and it was the secondary effects of the shells exploding, which wounded them. I would say the operator fired as accurately as a robot probably could have under those circumstances. There's been talk, and there's all kinds of articles on the subject as well, too. An interesting one just came out today in Ethics and Information Technology or something like that, summarizing what the last 3 years of the discussions at the Geneva Conventions have addressed. The real fundamental question right now that the world is wrestling with, and these all address IHL questions, should they be banned in the CCW proactively? To do that, some people argue we need good definitions. Some people are saying we don't even need definitions anymore, we just need to do it. I'm not sure what that means, but that's some of the arguments that we're hearing. Others, such as myself, would say that we need to regulate and create better specifications under which circumstances it's permissible and which circumstances it is impermissible. My basic test is that if we can't do better than human beings in the battlefield with respect to non-combatant casualties, these systems should not be used. And we can't do that now. So in that sense, that's why I call for a moratorium, which would potentially allow that to occur. There's all kinds of discussion on all different aspects of this, but the bottom line that it comes to are threefold. One is preemptive ban on something. 2, modify IHL to incorporate regulations under the circumstances under which certain systems should be deployed. And 3 is don't do anything at this point. And different nations have different perspectives on that.
Thank you.
Your argument is primarily one that's consequentialist or utilitarian in nature. And there's a classic issue with utilitarianism in short-term versus long-term consequences. And so when your point in terms of reducing the death of non-combatants is strictly a short-term scenario. But how do you consider the long-term scenarios of what occurs as a result of that?
Good question. There's 2 effects of that. One is the jus ad bellum arguments, which I mentioned before, is does this over any other technology increase the likelihood of a nation being adventuristic? Someone thumbs their nose at us, are we going to send our robotic warfighters in to punish them or do whatever we want? Or some other nation do the same. The potential for that actually exists, and that's something that has to be considered. Whether it's, again, specific to this, just as cyber warfare and other things as well, too, the question is how do we control the development of new military technology? So that's one aspect of that. The second one I have to think a little bit more about. It deals with effects such as violations of dignity and, as I mentioned, the winning hearts and minds. Some argue, including the chief rapporteur of the summary executions and extrajudicial executions, says that being killed by a robot is a violation of human dignity. Okay, maybe it is. from a consequentialist perspective, I have to weigh that off against the saving of human life. In the United Nations, all rights at some level are equal. In a utilitarian case, the saving of a human life may be of greater value under those circumstances. So that's where the heart of the deontological arguments lie, which to some extent are the human rights arguments associated with that. So preserving human dignity, the issue of if you're killed by a robot, will you be more likely to join a jihad or whatever it is and fight and propagate and prolong the fight? Those are secondary questions. I don't have answers for those, but I argue that we have to continue the discussion. And I have always said, and I didn't say it quite here yet, but I am now, that the discussion that my research engendered is as important, if not more important, than the research itself. And I like to think that the work that I've been doing in this space has helped forward the discussion in many ways.
Ron, we've seen an increasing militarization of the police in this country. Police departments around the country are starting to get drone technology, for example, for different kinds of surveillance, crowd control, that kind of thing. What do you see as the advantages and the major pitfalls to having autonomous policemen, essentially? I mean, robots.
RoboCop.
Robocops, yeah, really. But to having, if this technology is in our military, eventually it's going to sink down into our police departments and various other security groups. Would this just result in a militarization or a weaponization of the public space?
That's an excellent question as well. There's actually going to be a workshop, a AAAS workshop in Washington in 2.5 weeks dealing with this issue of what is often referred to as civilian blowback. The question, when we create this technology for a particular use in a particular sector, it can ultimately get used in a different sector in the civilians and that. The military actually has rules of engagement in warfare, but they have something called the rules for the use of force, which is often dealing with escalating force and other things in domestic situations, which are fundamentally different. You try to kill somebody in a battlefield situation. You try and get someone to surrender in a domestic situation. So I'm concerned, as I think you are, about the transition of this technology into this particular sector. There can be potential benefits, as we've seen from autonomous vehicles. One of the goals for autonomous driving cars is actually the reduction of civilian casualties. That's the primary justification for it, is that people are really bad at driving. They get drunk, they get angry, and they kill each other, and we tolerate those deaths, and maybe we can do better. But we have to be careful about protecting the rights of individuals as well as we move into this space. I'll have better considerations of that in maybe 3 weeks' time, but right now it'll be an interesting workshop, but it is of serious concern, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you for coming. Good presentation. I have a question about value judgments. I know we're not really discussing the possibility of using UAVs across the entire battlefield, but I can tell you from personal experience, because I've been through this, that decisions on the battlefield are not based on the laws of land warfare or based on orders or any of those types of things. Leaders have to make value judgments in each situation they're in. So how do we program these types of vehicles or robots to make those kind of value judgments? We can put the information in, but we can't give them the ability that we have, or can we, to make that decision, because there are nuances in every situation where we have to make differences of opinion or differences of your gut feelings, these types of things, based on all that other data.
Sure. Good question. One of the strategies is that we can take advantage of experienced warfighters. There's a technique in artificial intelligence called case-based reasoning, which is able, we've used this in the context of UAV operators, for example, and snipers at Fort Benning and the like as well too, looking at how they assess a particular situation and drawing from their experience and finding analogous situations and bringing to bear their mapping as appropriate under those particular circumstances. But I should say one thing, that if the situation can't be assessed effectively, the robot should be able to recognize that and operate under a principle of first do no harm, as opposed to shoot first and ask questions later. So they can act again more conservatively, which is what I tried to point out as well. But there are some AI techniques which I do think can capture some, not all, but some of that battlefield experience in terms of proportionality in particular. To choose the right weapon system under the correct circumstances, to be able to make good judgments and good tactical decisions as to the way to approach that. But I would also contend that these systems will use fundamentally different tactics than traditional warfighters have used in the past. So that's my best response for you at this point.
Thank you.
Time for one more question.
Okay. I'd like to address the short versus long-term issues in a little more depth. Back when artillery was introduced to European warfare, it was considered horrific and indiscriminate with respect to civilians, etc. I think I read that the Pope proactively excommunicated anyone operating artillery at the time. And then we get to World War I, when this great technological development was supposed to end this indiscrimination to some degree, to give tactical advantage without ultimate loss of life. And as long as the enemy takes the countermeasures which will slow them down, which was gas warfare, which proved in hindsight to be so horrific that there was no incident in the European theater of gas warfare in World War II. And so what might prove to be a near-term advantage in saving non-combatants might ultimately be more horrific in the long run. We can look at also the logical extension of this. Speculative fiction has been dealing with, the end game quite a bit. There's an interesting text on philosophy in Star Trek. And from the original Star Trek episode, there was an episode where a war had been going on for, centuries, if not millennia, where it was totally painless and there were no non-combatants injured. Just it would be figured out how many casualties on each side, and then the citizens, to prevent a messy war, would just go into the euthanasia chambers, and that would be it. It removed, because of the removal of the horror of war, it persisted indefinitely. At least that was the thesis of that episode.
So several points. Actually, I would like to bring up Pope Innocent II actually banned the crossbow in 1100 around there as well too, because any serf could kill a knight, a Christian knight, with that as well too. So that weapon was considered immoral. But almost every new weapon system to some degree has struggled to get into legality, and some have, and like poison gases, which are inherently indiscriminate, have not. Anti-personnel landmines as well too, although we haven't signed the Ottawa Accords, or another example as well too of indiscriminate weapon systems. But if these systems are done correctly, they will end up on the other side of that particular spectrum. But that doesn't speak to the bloodless or the horrorless war that you were describing. And actually, I have always advocated that a human presence must be maintained in the battlefield, that these should not ever be robotic systems going off to war, that human beings have to be present in the battlefield, and these systems should always be adjuncts to human battlefield for exactly that reason, for the fact that the horror of war must be experienced and must be maintained. As, who was it, Lee, that said, otherwise we would love it too much if it in his view. War is truly horrific, and we can never, ever forget that. But if you view these as, I believe the military is looking these not replacements for the warfighter, but as adjuncts to make them more effective, maybe that will have the payback. But there are different futures. There are dystopian futures that can be seen, and there are futures that can lead to potentially better outcomes than we currently have. We need to investigate them before we ban them. That's all I'm saying at this point in time.
Thank you again.
Thank you.